So I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Kate White. I'm coming to you from the University of British Columbia, Canada. And actually, I'm going to be kind of changing gears a little bit in terms of what we're talking about. And so what I'm going to be talking about is encouraging individuals and residents to engage in sustainable behaviors like recycling. And I admit that my title is probably the longest one on the list. So it sounds a little bit complicated, but it's actually a really simple idea. And so the idea is that if we can match elements of our messaging so that they're congruent, we can actually make the information easier to process, we can make it easier to understand, and making it easier to understand makes it seem like it's easier to do. And the good thing about that is when it seems easier to do, people are more likely to do it. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so in terms of getting people to do sustainable behaviors, things like energy conservation, recycling, there's an important challenge. And so the challenge is that usually what we're asking people to do is something that's sort of some kind of a cost to the individual self. So it's either inconvenient, or it takes time, or it's causing me to change my behavior as an individual. And the payoff is kind of more general, and it's for others, and it's for the future. So we're asking people to take some kind of individual level, immediate cost to the self, and the payoff is for sort of others or for the future. So it's hard to get people sometimes to make these kinds of trade-offs. And so that's really what I'm interested in studying, and that's where I'm coming from with some of this research. And so I actually did this research when I was at the city of Calgary. So there's the city of Calgary, in case you didn't know. That's what it looks like. And basically what they were doing is they were introducing a new residential recycling, sort of curbside recycling program. And they'd done some tests, some sort of market testing in certain quadrants of the city. And they found that people were pretty good at complying, pretty good at doing the recycling behaviors, but they weren't quite as good as they had hoped. And so they were finding some sort of pockets of resistance. And they sort of had done some test communications where they kind of did an informational campaign about this is recycling, this is what you do, here are the steps. And they weren't really finding that not everybody was really getting on board. And so City of Calgary asked me to help them figure out a way to sort of, how do we get these people on board? Oh, wrong way. Okay. And so what I started looking at was actually something called message framing. And the idea behind message framing is that there's kind of two different ways you as a communicator can frame a message. So the first one is a loss frame message. So a loss frame message is one where sort of the negative consequences of not engaging in the behavior are highlighted, right? So if you don't recycle, these are all the negative things that will happen. A gain frame message is one that talks about what will be gained if you do recycle. So what are all the positive consequences of engaging in the behavior? So what are all the positive consequences of recycling? And people interested in behavior change look at this quite a bit. So health psychologists, things like that, there's been a lot of work in loss frames versus gain frames. But when I looked at research on conservation behaviors, so things like water conservation, energy conservation, there seemed to be some mixed results. So sometimes the research said loss frames work best, they're more motivational, you should always use a loss frame. Other research said, no, gain frames work best. And so it was a bit confusing. And so what we wanted to look at is, well, maybe it depends. So maybe sometimes loss frames work better, and sometimes gain frames work better. Oh, I don't know why I keep doing that. Sorry, guys. And so what we wanted to do is look at a moderator. And a moderator just means it depends on something else. And we looked at this theory. It's called construal level theory. And it's actually kind of a simple idea. So the idea is that there's two different ways that people can view the world. So the first one is a concrete way of viewing the world, or an activity, so something like recycling. So a concrete mindset is one where you're thinking very specifically about the lower level details of the behavior or the activity. So when you were thinking about coming to this conference today, the sort of concrete thoughts around coming to this conference today were things like, what will I pack? How will I get my flight? What talks will I go to? So sort of the details, the how of what you're going to do when you're at the conference. On the other hand, the other way of sort of thinking about it could be more abstract. So abstract has to do with higher level thinking in more general terms. So in terms of coming to this conference today, you might have thought about, well, I'm really excited about learning more or bettering my education or integrating my experience. So those are more general thoughts about the activity. In terms of coming back to the domain of recycling, what we thought is that there's two different ways residents can think about recycling. So the first is a more concrete way. So thinking about the details. So how will I organize the bottles? How will I take the labels off? When will I put it out? Those are the details, the concrete details of recycling. The other one is abstract, so thinking in a more abstract mindset. So why will I recycle? What's good about it? Why should I do it? Those are more general thoughts about recycling. And so what we think is actually that if you match the frame, so the loss or the gain, to the right type of mindset, you can actually encourage consumers to process the information better and to make the activity seem easier to do. And so we think that losses themselves, so thinking about a loss frame, actually puts people in this sort of action-oriented, very concrete type of mindset itself. So it makes you think about the details. And if you compare the loss frame, you can pair the loss frame with this more concrete type of mindset, it's actually going to work really well. So we're basically just saying, match it. Match the messaging in a way that puts sort of the concrete thoughts, or the concrete way of thinking, with the loss frames, and it's going to be more effective in getting people to do these behaviors. On the other hand, we think that gain frames put people in sort of a broader level of thinking. They make them think more abstractly. And so sort of similarly, if you compare a gain frame message with more of an abstract appeal, this is going to be more effective in getting people to do the behavior. And so what we did is we did a field study with the City of Calgary. And this was with the residential recycling program. So there's the cart. Basically, the idea is you put your materials in the cart and you have to wheel it down to the curb and they get taken away for recycling. And what we were able to do was an experimental design. And so what we varied was the mindset or the construal level that was being sort of primed in a marketing message. And the marketing message was presented in the form of a door hanger. The door hanger was recyclable material and fully made of recyclable material, so we didn't seem like we were being inconsistent. And so it either had a very concrete message or an abstract message, and I'll show you those in a second. And then we also paired it with either a loss frame or a gain frame. The other thing we had was a control group. So the control group was a group that got nothing. So what happens if they get no message at all? And so this is kind of what it would look like. So people either got the concrete, focusing on the how do I recycle, what are the details, or they would get the abstract message, so why do we recycle, thinking about the broader context. And then that was either paired with a loss frame or a gain frame. And so the overall view of how we did this is we went in at the first week, and we did a pre-test of recycling behaviors. So all that was is it meant me getting an army of research assistants to help me and actually looking in people's recycling bins, which I'll tell you what we look for in a second, which actually isn't as bad as it sounds. The bad part was getting up before the trucks come to pick up the recycling. They start at 6 a.m. In November in Calgary, being on the street at 5 a.m. is not enjoyable, just in case you're wondering. So we did the pre-test of recycling behaviors week 1. Week 2, we delivered the marketing materials. And then week 3, we went back and we went and looked in the recycling bins again and recorded the same measures to sort of see how did these change over time after we implemented the different messages. Month 6, we went back again. One of our reviewers, when we submitted our research, said, hey, why don't you guys go back 6 months later and see if it continues over time? And we'll see. I'll show you how it worked out. At the time, I was kind of mad at the reviewer, but I'm okay now. I'm okay. So what did we measure? So that's sort of what a typical bin looks like. And there's some logistical issues with doing this. So we had to think of some certain things. And so most of Calgary has most of the households have back alleys, and it's kind of hard to tell if they're putting out their recycling or not, because everybody's recycling bin is just sitting there. So what we had to do was choose a neighborhood where it was clear if they were participating or not. And so we chose a neighborhood where they would actually have to roll it out to the front yard, so we could tell if they were participating or not. And we chose a neighborhood that wasn't too inner city because we didn't want it to be the case that homeless people might be going into the bins and taking certain objects out. We really wanted to try to get an accurate measure of really what are people putting in their bins, and are they following instructions, and what kind of materials are going in. So there were some logistical issues to think about in terms of what neighborhood we chose. And these are the things we measured. So the first thing we measured was participation. And so we coded this at different time points, obviously. So basically, did you put your card out or not? Was the measure of participation. The second thing we measured was volume. Now, volume was tricky because of ethical issues, we weren't allowed to go in and sort of weigh or sort through and dig into people's recycling, but we did develop a way to kind of measure the volume. And so what we did is we created a measuring stick that was sort of the height of the bin, and we used that. So whatever the height was, we had like a pyramid calculator, and we could kind of calculate what the volume was of materials that were going into the bin. We asked ethics if we could take pictures. They wouldn't let us. So we tried to get other ways in, but that's how we had to do it. The other thing we measured was following instructions. So the city of Calgary wanted consumers or residents to do certain things, and they weren't really following instructions very well. So the bin has to be a certain distance away from the household. The lid has to be closed, and it has to be pointing in the right direction, or the truck can't pick it up. So we sort of checked off to see whether or not people were following these instructions. And the last one is variety. And variety was tricky because we couldn't necessarily empty the whole bin, but we could move our stick around and have a pretty good peek. So, and the variety was based on what the city cared about. So they had 5 categories. So they had glass, they had paper and cardboard, aluminum, I'm missing one, glass, and then the other one is actually beverage containers. So things like milk containers and drink box containers, they have as a separate category. And so they really wanted to encourage the sort of full breadth of variety of recycling. Okay, so what did our messages look like? So in the concrete construal condition, it was all about how to make a difference. So the tagline was, think about ways to make a difference. And these are all the details. So these are the things you can recycle. One of the big problems is putting mixed materials in the bin, which means it's a product that's made of maybe plastic and cardboard, and you can't recycle that unless you take the pieces apart. And then, just the details about how to do it and when to do it. In the abstract construal condition, it was all about why to make a difference. So think about reasons to make a difference. So it's sort of this higher level, why should we be doing this? So recycling will save our precious air, land, and water resources. Recycling contributes to our community. So much more general statements about why we should be recycling. And then on the other side of the door hanger, there was either the loss or the gain. So the loss frame is think about what will be lost in your community if we don't keep recycling. And then these sort of statements were all loss frames. So things like, by not participating in the Blue Card program, we waste over 60,000 tons of paper. If we don't recycle, we will lose over 10,000 school buses full of plastic. They were all sort of what will be lost if we don't recycle. The gain frames had the same information. So think of what will be gained in our community if we do recycle, but they were all positively framed. So we will save over 60,000 tons of paper, or we will save over 10,000 school buses of plastic. So just different framing of the message. So what did we find? So these are the measures of participation, and they're coded for an increase. So a higher number means an increase in participation over time. And so if we take a look, pairing the loss with the how, so the messages that we think are going to activate this more of a sort of a concrete mindset, or sort of focusing on the details, pairing those two together works quite effectively, more so than a control condition and these mismatched conditions over here. Also, the gain and y together seem to work really well at encouraging residents to engage in the behavior, more so than the control group. And if you look at the mismatched conditions, so the loss y and the gain how, they don't perform any better than the control group either. So this is volume. So how much material were they putting in the bins? And the pattern's the same. So the match of the loss and how works particularly well. The match of gain and y, they're not significantly different, although sometimes it looks like they might be. Those two seem to work the best, and they're more effective at encouraging residents to put more products or more material in their bin than the control and then the conditions that are mismatched. You're going to get the idea. So variety, so putting in a variety of different products or materials into the bin. The match of loss and how and the match of gain and y works particularly well, whereas the other conditions, so the mismatched conditions, the loss y and the gain how, are about as effective as a control group, just about as effective as not giving a message at all. And following instructions, same thing. So the match works best. So the loss with the how and the gain frame with the y works better than the other conditions. Okay, here's the really interesting thing. So I mentioned this, the 6 months later, the follow-up. And we did this for all the measures. I was a little bit disheartened when the reviewer said that because I was thinking I have to get out my maps, I have to figure out the routes. It's probably not going to work. I hoped it would work. And it actually held pretty nicely. And so this is just the measure of volume. But we did go and do all of our measures, and it was sort of the same pattern for all the measures. And so what we found that over time, so the first bar is time 1 minus time 2, so the 3 weeks later. And the second bar is time 1 minus time 3, which is 6 months later. And so what you can see, is that the loss how sort of held over time in terms of people and the volume that they were putting into the recycling bin. And the gain y really held over time. So more so than the control condition and more so than the mismatch conditions. So a couple of things. It seems that having a match in terms of messaging seems to work really well. And it works across all of these different measures. The other thing we did is we included a measure of what people that are interested in recycling call contamination. And contamination is throwing things into the bin that you shouldn't be. And one potential explanation is, well, you increased in volume in certain conditions, but how do you know they're throwing the right things in there? Maybe they're throwing in things they shouldn't be. And there were certainly things in there that shouldn't have been there. So people were putting in tools and toilet seats and kitchenware and just things that shouldn't be there. So we did record that as well. And so all of our results hold when controlling for contamination. And we find that having the match in messaging actually reduces contamination. So people are more careful about what they're putting in there. Okay. So we did a second study. And this time what we wanted to do is look at our manipulation of this idea of construal level, so the concrete and the abstract, in a slightly different way. And so there's research that suggests that if you're thinking about something that's really close in the future, like right now, you're going to be thinking more concretely, more about the details. But if you're thinking about something that's coming up in the future, sort of far off in the future, it's more likely you're going to be thinking about it abstractly. And so there's quite a bit of research that supports this. So what we wanted to do in this study is manipulate this idea of concrete and abstract by using time. So are you focusing in more on the near future, or are you focusing further on into the far future? The other thing we wanted to do is use a more simple and more controlled execution of the framing. So you might have noticed that some of the wording was a little bit different across conditions with the City of Calgary example. And so in here, what we wanted to do is really have very controlled manipulations. So you can't explain it in terms of the different wording. It really is what we're manipulating. It's the close versus far, or the concrete versus abstract, and it really is the gain and the loss frame. And so here's what we think. We think that the loss frame message is going to really work well when it's framed in terms of something closer to you, so focusing on today. And we think that the gain frame is going to work really well when it's focusing on a time point that's further away, so focusing on tomorrow. So here's what we did. This time we used undergraduates, and we manipulated two things. So the one thing we wanted to do was make it close in time or far in time, and then we wanted to either do the loss or the gain frame. And the time manipulation was just a very simple statement. So they saw an advertising proof from the city of Calgary, and the tagline either said, "Recycle for a better Calgary today," or it said, "Recycle for a better Calgary tomorrow." So a very straightforward, simple execution. And the other thing that we did was we had a different message frame manipulation. So think about what will be gained if you recycle, or think about what will be lost if you recycle. And this time what we measured was recycling intentions. And so things like this. So how likely are you to use the City of Calgary's recycling program? How inclined are you? How willing are you? And so here's what we found. So in terms of the loss frame, thinking about it more proximally, so the close time point seems to be more effective in encouraging more positive intentions. But if you look at, I just got technophobia today. If you look at the gain frame, it works much better when it's focused on the distant time point. And so once again, we get this matching effect. So losses work better when it's more concrete. Gains work better when it's more abstract. The last thing we wanted to do is try to figure out what's going on. And so what we think is going on is something that researchers call fluency, and it sounds kind of fancy, but all it means is it's easy to understand. So we think that matching the message makes it easy to process, it makes it easy to understand, and the interesting part of this is we think that making fluency higher, so making it easy to understand, actually makes it seem easier to do. And psychologists like to call that efficacy, but it just means I think I can do it. I think I can impact change through this behavior. And so basically, making a match in terms of messaging makes it seem easier to process, easier to understand. Making it easier to understand makes it seem like it's easier to do. And then I'm going to be more likely to do it, or more likely my intentions are going to be higher to do it. So in this study, we used undergraduates again because we wanted to get in and look at sort of the process of what was going on. And they actually viewed the same appeals that were used in the City of Calgary study. So they either saw that same gain or loss frame, and then they either saw the more concrete or the more abstract message. We also included some measures to assess this idea of fluency. And so these are ones that have been used before in the literature. So is it difficult to process or easy to process? Is it difficult to understand? Is it easy to understand? Is it difficult to comprehend or easy to comprehend? And then we included some measures of efficacy. So I feel like I know how to go about recycling. I believe I know what steps to take. So I feel like I can do this, and I feel like I understand how it works. And then once again, we included the measure of recycling intentions. And so here's what we find. So a similar pattern again. So if you look at the how message works particularly well with the loss frame, and the why message works particularly well with the gain frame, once again. And then what we did is we wanted to go and look at sort of what's going on in terms of driving these effects. And so this is what we actually did in the paper. I'm not even going to talk about it because it's the structural equation modeling. We're not going to talk about that. We're just going to go back to this. So the idea is with mediation analysis, what we found is that we find this sort of pathway where making a match does seem to make it easier to understand. And it seems like from the statistical analysis, making it easier to understand does impact making it seem easy to do. And then making it seem easy to do does impact these recycling outcomes. So I think it's kind of an exciting finding because just making it seem sort of conceptually or mentally easy to do makes it or easier to process makes it actually seem easier to do. Okay. So some of the conclusions, obviously it's interesting that there's this interplay between messaging and construal level. So loss frames seem to work best when they're with these more concrete or sort of proximally close messages. Gain frames work really well when they're with these abstract or sort of distant messages in terms of time. And the really exciting thing, I think, is that making it easier to understand makes it seem easier to do. It's a simple message, and it's something I think could be done in a lot of different contexts with different types of messaging. So why is this useful? One of the interesting things, I think, is that this worked with a field study with real behaviors that it held 6 months later. So this idea of when you get people to engage in a process, it can have positive consequences downstream. I think this carries over into this from the previous presentations as well. And if you think about it, when you're coming home from work, there's a door hanger on your door, you're holding your groceries, you're grabbing your kids, you're picking up the mail. There's all these things interfering with what you're doing. And probably not everybody looked at both sides of our door hanger and read it really carefully, but we still got the effects. So the fact that we can get these effects in the real world, I think, is pretty exciting. So obviously, one of the implications is match the appeal to the marketing message. And this doesn't have to necessarily be in the domain of recycling. So in Canada, we have quite graphic smoking labels on our cigarette packages. I don't know if you've seen them. Some of them are a little disturbing. Most of them are loss frames. And part of this is because the Government of Canada mandates what type of information has to be on those packages or on those labels. And it has to be about health consequences. And the health consequences of smoking are negative. So they're all very loss-framed messages. And so it would suggest that as a communicator, if you know you have to communicate a loss-frame message, you might want to pair it or put it in a context where you're also getting people to think about the details, about the concrete aspects of the behavior or of the situation. Making it easy to process can make it seem easy to do. So anything in your marketing materials or in terms of pairing messages, if you can make it easier to understand, it might make it seem easier to carry out the behavior. The other thing to think about is whatever you're asking people to do, if it's a behavior change type of activity, if you can match the timing to the message, that can be effective too. So if it's something that you want people to do right now, a very concrete message might be more effective. So I want you to go vote tomorrow. Perhaps a more concrete message is going to be more likely to drive them to action. If it's something further down in the future, it might make more sense to match your messaging with more of an abstract appeal so that it's sort of more fluent in terms of how people are thinking about it. So future research, one thing I mentioned is that I don't think this necessarily has to be in the context of recycling. It was a nice context for us to look at it in. So I think that similar kind of matching effects might emerge for other behaviors too. So I mentioned health change, that kind of thing. One question is, would it work as well for more unfamiliar behaviors? So obviously we all know how to recycle. It's pretty common. It's nice that we can get some movement on people's recycling behaviors. But what about things that are unfamiliar or that we don't know as much about? And so one of the things I'm working on right now with the City of Calgary, something they call grass cycling. Has anyone heard of it? Oh, I'm impressed. Couple. And it's kind of an odd term, but it's an interesting idea. And so what the problem is the city seems to get these sort of spikes in terms of garbage disposal. And one of the spikes is Christmas time. Because all the food we eat and all the extra packaging all goes into the landfill. The city kind of says, well, I don't think we can sort of tackle Christmas time. But the other big spike in consumption and then disposal is the summer. And it's a different type of disposal. What it is it's actually yard waste. And the problem with throwing yard waste in the landfill is that it's compostable. It sort of naturally regenerates itself. But what we're doing is we're throwing it in the landfill, we're covering it up, making it get no oxygen, and it's just sitting there for much longer than it really needs to be. And so what the City of Calgary wants residents to do, they're calling it grass cycling. So what people in Calgary tend to do is they tend to have big lawns, they tend to mow the lawn, they tend to rake up all the grass, carry put it all in a bag, carry the bag to the back curb, and sort of put it into the landfill. And so what the city of Calgary wants residents to do is mow your grass and just leave the clippings on the lawn. So it's interesting because they're actually saying, usually with these behavior change things, we want people to do more work. But this time we were like, no, don't rake up the grass, don't put it in the garbage bags, don't put it on the curb, don't do it. And they sort of launched an informational campaign trying to get people to do this idea of grass cycling, and nobody will do it. So they're very, very hesitant to do it. And the big problem is, what will my neighbor think? Right? If all my neighbors are raking their lawns, they're making it all look pretty, no one else is doing this grass cycling thing, right? Why should I be doing it? And so what we're looking at now is we're doing messaging around norms. So what is everybody else doing? And what does everybody else think I should be doing? And trying to match the messaging there. So yes. Why? Because of this idea of grass cycling? Or so just getting, can we get kind of similar effects in terms of other behaviors too? So questions? Yeah?
See, any sort of messaging to take transit or anything about sustainability about transit-oriented development?
Yeah, so you're thinking in terms of transit and
Out of their cars into transit for the benefit of the environment. And
yeah. So our research would suggest just in your messaging, try to make things sort of congruent. So if you're getting people to change, maybe if it's more of a short-term focus, like try it tomorrow, right? You might sort of focus more on these losses. Or if it's a long-term sort of focus, think of the future, then you might sort of do more of sort of matching with a gain frame. Might be something I'd recommend. Yeah.
On the grass cycling, how did you get underneath what was preventing people from just ignoring the grass clippings? Was it a survey?
Yeah, we did market research. We actually have done a study, and the way we measure grass cycling is kind of fun. And it's even more fun than looking at people's recycling bins. We actually follow the garbage truck, and the garbage collectors, they're pretty good at feeling it and knowing what's in the bag, and they kind of signal what's in the bag. So I have my research assistants, they're following the garbage trucks. And the garbage collectors are really nice about helping us because we pay them with beer. So it's off the record, not on the job, but so we did do market research, and that's what really came out is we're really worried about what other people think. That was one of the top reasons that came out. So, yeah.
So in this increasingly political season, it's hard to imagine that gain versus loss messaging hasn't been extensively studied in terms of correlations with political philosophies. I'm wondering if you know of any work.
I don't know, but that's really interesting. And conceptually, it seems like it might be very interesting to look at. Yeah, I don't know, but that does sound very interesting.
Negative ads, and they said, you know what, they work. That's why we do them. They work, and they were interviewing some people and talking to them. And
I wonder if it works better for certain parties than others. I don't. Yeah.
Well, I mean, at risk of throwing political stereotypes, there's this perception that liberal versus conservatives, that liberals tend to focus on the promise of the future and what can go right about the future, and conservatives tend to focus more on what can go wrong. And I'm wondering if it seems to me there must be some work on this.
This was around the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Versus Santorum
Sure.
versus Gingrich.
No, but I think your tuition seems right, but I don't know if there's been anything done on it, but it sounds like it would work. Sounds interesting. Yeah.
Strong literature in crisis communications that actually says the human brain overweighs negative information 3 to 4 to 1 over positive. And if you think about it as an adaptive behavior for us 1,000 years, 2,000 years ago, dealing with threats was much more important than dealing with positive things.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. If you did the research with other than undergrads, but you did it with adults, I'm wondering whether or not the longer term issue might be differently weighted. The whole concept of intergenerational discounting right? Doesn't seem to have the strongest way with undergrads, but it might with the general population.
Yeah.
Any concept about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. So when we think about time, as we get older, the way that we think about that can differ. So do you have an intuition about that? Do you think it might be stronger?
Suggests that for adults, anything that's more than 4 or 5 years out gets discounted functionally to zero.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
This is why we still drive cars, get on airplanes, and spoil it, even if rationally we know we're destroying our kids' lives.
Yeah. So I don't know if that particular study would vary by age, but it's an open question. Yeah. Oh,
You can have culture to that as well.
sure. What were you
There's certain cultures that tend to look at long term.
Sure, like long-term orientation and long-term focus. One more?
I figure while the fluency is being a key part of it, I wonder if you look at some of these behaviors that are actually quite complicated. So if you get into composting, effective composting is actually a fairly difficult process to get right.
There's more details to know.
Yeah, there's more details.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how do those type of behaviors work in your fluency model or that piece of your model?
I didn't test it with the composting idea, so I don't know for sure. But that's a good question. If it's more complicated behavior, it might be that something with the details might help more, right? So that's one of the questions, right? We know how to recycle. We might need a little bit of information about what counts, what doesn't count. But you're right, composting is maybe more complicated. So then the question might be, would the sort of the how be really important and the loss be really important? I don't know yet. So, but that's a good possibility.
Right. I don't, it's interesting. Would it be overwhelming? The
Yes.
how is part of it?
Yeah.
Sometimes I see some of my work.
Yeah.
Is the how can be
Too much
quite
detail.
overwhelming. So would the abstract
Yeah.
message then be more compelling because people would invest the time? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's
I don't know.
Interesting
Yeah.
conversation.
I forgot, I have to say thank you.